And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. The World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos will begin on January the 21st, the last until the 24th. Yet the 2020 event is significant for two reasons. First, it will mark the 50th anniversary of this prestigious gathering, and it comes at a time when the global markets are entangled in trade concerns, digital risks, and geopolitical uncertainties. That explains why priorities for this year's forum include technology, geopolitics, ecology, and trends in industry. Let's take a look.
From above, it looks like just another quiet town in the Swiss Alps. For 1 week, every January, though, Davos is essentially taken over. 1,000 or so of some of the world's biggest companies paid big bucks to set up shop in the town centre. Following them soon, some 250 political leaders, including US President Donald Trump. Security here is intense. The World Economic Forum gets underway on Tuesday for the 50th time. From the Gilets jaunes in France to demonstrations in Chile these past 12 months, there is a groundswell of anger from those who say they've been left behind by globalization. Then there's the climate protests, seemingly a separate issue. But what links the two is a joint sense that the gap between citizens and their leaders has widened. Protests haven't really featured at previous forums. This time could be different. In the build-up, Greta Thunberg has been calling for demonstrators to keep the pressure up outside the conference hall. Thunberg will be topping this year's programme inside.
The truth is, if you want to get the world's leaders into a room and bang some heads together and get the messages heard loud and clear and walk away with some kind of solid deliverable actions, then it's not a bad idea putting them into a small town, but it's very, very hard for them to escape from.
Escape they eventually will, though, on Friday afternoon, when we'll find out whether all the talk of action this time will be anything more than just that.
For more on the Davos gathering, we'll speak to, from London, Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Durrandor Forum at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Shanghai, Mr. Jimmy Zhu, chief strategist at the Fullerton Research. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Much expectation as to what World Economic Forum this time can achieve, given it's such a time of tremendous changes. Professor Begg.
Well, yes, Davos always looks to be the point in the annual calendar where some of the more difficult issues at least get confronted. They don't often get solved at Davos. But the important thing is people keep talking, and that's maybe one of the advantages of having a forum like Davos, is to bring people together rather than having them throwing things at each other from a distance.
Mr. Zhu, of course, one of the biggest issues is whether the stakeholders, as being indicated this year, of the world will be able to come together to brainstorm and be able to come up with solutions. Now, these stakeholders are very wide, according to the World Economic Forum this year particularly. Mr. Zhu, do you think there's common ground?
I think one of the main concerns for this year is still the trades, especially at this moment. US and China just reached the phase 1 deal, and currently I think the good thing is compared to the past 2 years, lots of business uncertainty seems like to got a chance to take an ease, since two sides are willing to make concessions, at least for the truth at this moment.
Professor Liu, as we know, it is not a stage for China-US trade negotiations, but rather a stage to talk about global issues, Professor Liu, all intertwined.
Yes, I think now this round of Davos has painted a bleak landscape about everything that is going on in the world, and particularly with regard to environmental degradation, economic stagnation, and the geopolitical division and possibly confrontation. So the logic is really to alert the world that united efforts are critically required for multi-stakeholders to work together towards a sustainable and cohesive world that can really better the environment and also the people.
Professor Beck, I have to borrow your history experience in a way, because at a time of dramatic changes, whether human beings, stakeholders as we say, will be able to proactively approach one another and try to be apathetic rather than just being selfish. It's a big question mark, isn't it? This Davos World Economic Forum is certainly a test of that.
Yeah, very, very much so. And the advantage of a place like Davos is when major decision makers are in the same place, they can at least look into each other's eyes and see whether they have a disposition to deal with the problems. There are many stakeholders, as you say, likely to be represented in Davos, including a large number of younger people this time round. And that's an opportunity for the next generation to talk to the current generation. In particular, as we heard the other day, the world is warming faster than ever before, so that's something that really has to be top of the agenda. The big challenge is, can you convince someone like Trump that it really is a threat and not something you can dismiss so airily?
But when it comes to long-term businesses, Mr. Zhu, you are coming from business yourself, will they be self-disciplined? Now at this moment, social media, for example, many of those companies that are having huge social media platforms are being asked by the society to be self-disciplined, even though there are questions coming from society and government. But is it possible?
It's possible. That also depends on how the regulators play in the field. And we noticed that actually there's a lot of listing companies, if they not meet those kind of requirements, probably they will receive some penalties from the exchange regulators. So I think everyone needs to work together on this part.
I'm not sure whether that is the case yet, Professor Begg.
Well, maybe not the case yet, but there's one thing that can often be critical, and that is the point of view of customers of these companies. If you're a customer of a company you perceive to be dirty, you are going to be more hostile to it if you think that it needs to do something much more extensive about environmental questions. A recent example is that BP, the large oil conglomerate, is in trouble with consumers in Europe because it's seen as not doing enough to promote cleaner energy, and it's become something of a pariah in its support for example, cultural activities. Museums and others are turning down grants from the likes of BP, just as they did recently over the opioid crisis in the US with the big pharmaceutical companies there.
So you're saying a top-down approach is not the way to go, but rather at this moment, citizens of the world have to act on their own. It's more a bottom-up approach that would work. Professor Beck, is that what you're trying to say?
To some extent, yes, but it's also movements. If the people, however we define the people, are saying to the corporate world, we no longer expect or tolerate you doing the things that we don't agree with, companies have to react. And we've seen this before where sometimes there's something known as the California effect, where higher environmental standards became a source of competitiveness rather than something to detract from competitiveness.
This is really your field, Professor Liu. I mean, but there's one word Professor Beck used. If companies are being perceived as not meeting the standard. Now, when you are being perceived, there's a degree of precision as to whether you are really doing it or only being perceived so. So, Professor Liu, how do you see, in a way, the informed society could play in all of these issues that we've been talking about, and the fact that these days it's more passive reading than proactive reading, if you look at the popularity of social media and how messages are being pushed to every reader around the world?
Well, to respond to what you asked about the discipline, I think there are, I always propose two types of CSRs. One is corporate social responsibility, and the other is citizen social rights. So they are contradicting, but they form a ecosystem of the business world with the consumer and in consideration. As for the perception, people now say perception is reality because you constantly bound on the table and send to people's ears and even mask people's eyes with irresponsible news, irresponsible stories and perspectives, and that's something very scary because merely relying on regulators, that's not enough, and that's also very costly. So it does require the general awakening of the people in the public, but of course the eternal discipline and competition is important for the most positive and for the most truthful ones.
It is not the very first time, not the second time, but repeatedly people have been talking about the problem of facts versus fakes. Mr. Zhu, do you see that as a fundamental issue we are facing now, no matter which issue we are talking about? Political leadership, economic growth rate, or sustainable development responsibilities and social responsibility, all of this, facts versus fakes.
Probably, I think for now, because we are it seems like we are living in a very diverse world. I mean, lots of the different countries, even the different sectors, seems to have the different opinions. So sometimes in some certain, in one facts, probably we have a lot of elaborations. Sentiment seems like drive the war. So it's also in this event. I mean, we can also take this advantage for the business leaders, policy makers, like how to synchronize the language, can make the world to synchronize with and communicate with each other much better.
Language probably is not the only issue here. Having said that, though, Professor Beck, I want to go to you once again. It's not just economy, not just business world, but the geopolitics. People say this is a juncture of change, but we only see symptoms of changes. We have not seen structural changes, and particularly conscious structural changes. Professor Begg, how far are we going to lag behind the real changes?
Well, it will vary according to the dossier you're looking at. I think there is now a growing awareness of the necessity of action on climate change, but you still have the fact, and this is a fact, not a fake, that the world is increasing its output of carbon, not diminishing it. And there are major challenges, particularly for some of the emerging markets, in getting away from carbon-emitting energy production towards alternatives. You've seen the process of change in China. It's not really happening yet in India, which is another emerging market likely to be a major contributor to global carbon emissions. So that's one dimension of this. But in other areas, such as thinking about how to regulate some of the power of the social media companies, I detect a groundswell trying to say it's time for change. They cannot continue to allow some of the things that generate fake news. And as an aside on that, there is an interesting observation for you and other journalists, which is that generating and reporting facts is expensive. Creating fake news is cheap, and that's one of the dilemmas that we have to face in regulating the flood of fake news.
And also about geopolitics as well, Professor Beck, if I could follow up. We have seen the rift of the members of so-called the West countries. United States with its European partners. You are coming from the UK. Right now you're based in the UK at least. So how do you see the visible divisions among these countries and yet lack of courage to make the change so that there will be important goals that can be achieved, Professor Beck?
Well, there are clearly big and difficult questions around, a lot of which come back to just one person, Donald Trump, because his erratic approach to international relations means that he's very unpredictable, and that creates his own tensions. Now, some say that his unpredictability is in fact an asset, because it means that countries like Iran, which seek to challenge him, can't really be clear what his response will be. The same with North Korea. Russia is a stabilizing influence to some extent, but also a provocative influence in some areas. Europe, you would say, punches beneath its weight in global matters. And one of the ambitions of the new European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, is to try to increase the weight with which Europe punches in global matters. So we are on the cusp of some changes, but I don't think anybody can really tell you at this point where they're going to lead.
Mr. Zhu, is that what you have found? Is the problem really Mr. Trump, one person?
I think probably it's not because of, not Trump caused the thing. Of course, he has a lot of things actually a bit make the world a bit unpredictable or uncomfortable. But I think one of the things is probably the social media we're talking about is really grow so fast because we are living in a world in past few years. The pace is much faster than in the past 10 years. So that's the reason of we saw the growing numbers of the social media, and it's kind of I'm not very sure about other countries, but in some major countries I know probably on the regulating on the fake news or real news probably there's not much clean line. So I think that's also the different countries share with the different languages and the cultures. So I think if that's the case, probably there will be some misunderstanding to come out, which is quite normal.
Cyber governance, of course, Professor Liu, is a big issue. There's a huge difference in how different governments and countries are doing that job and with what standard, Professor Liu. And that is not just one issue itself because it's paved the foundation for many other divisions that we have seen in geopolitics, economy, society issues, many. So, Professor Liu, how do you see that?
Yeah,
as a fundamental issue?
Yeah, cyberspace has really opened a new world and new window opportunity for people on this planet. But in the meantime, there are a lot of uncharted areas and unregulated areas that people need to be aware of. So given all the positive contribution to economic growth and to people's coming together in better communication, but how we can really go to those fundamentals to respect the basic human rights, privacy, and business secrets, and in the meantime to utilize it in a positive way, like e-commerce and responsible social media. And these are really the questions that can be deeply discussed at Davos, so that we can really come up with some tangible solutions.
We've been deeply discussing them many times. No solution, Professor Beck, only more differences in terms of how governance is being done.
Well, there are solutions on the table. You may be familiar with something called the GDPR, the European approach to data protection. That could become a global standard, but it does require other major regions of the world, particularly China and the US, to adopt the same kind of philosophy, to say, as Professor Liu said, data privacy is significant. Who owns data? Are the data that are held by companies about me and you and others mine or theirs to use as they dispose? These are major challenges which I think governance is having to confront in the cyber area.
Right.
And maybe it needs a big international convention on it to try to work out the way forward.
Another elephant in the room, gentlemen, we haven't mentioned is what's going to happen to the two largest economies if we didn't count EU, because EU is an entity, rather, into the picture. China and the United States. Many are very concerned whether there's going to be new Cold War or whether there's going to be even hot war or conflict. Mr. Zhu, how much do you think those issues can be further analyzed at the World Economic Forum? And by the way, that's likely also to be the theme of the rest of the year, Mr. Zhu.
The good news is we reached some truths as mentioned earlier, but the bad news is at this moment the visibility is still very low. Based on the partial deal existing, what we see is that they're demanding on 200 billion buying in the next 2 years. Probably China needs to pick up another 50% for each year compared to the buying from US in 2018. So It's very difficult to say whether the tariff will be, or the tension probably will come back again in some certain point in this year. But I believe that in order to achieve that, improving the domestic demands in China also very important, because that seems that the easiest way to achieve those targets by U.S.
Professor Liu, it's believed that President Trump might also select another opportunity to visit China later this year. At least that's what he indicated. Having said that, though, he's going to be there in Davos at the World Economic Forum if he goes as promised, because he promised last year. He didn't go either. But anyway, Professor Liu, how much do you think the rest of the international community can do in order to avoid a new Cold War?
I think a consensus is required, particularly at this critical moment, for the rest of the countries to get really concerted actions against protectionism and defend the multilateral trading platform. And so China is really working very closely now with EU with regard to investment facilitation, and China is also very much involved in the RCEP negotiation, trilateral free trade agreement between China and Japan and South Korea. So I think now China does really present a good example, and so the whole theme of Davos is cohesiveness and sustainability. So every country has to act in a more responsible way to contribute to cohesiveness and sustainability of the world, which is really risking fragmentation and protectionism.
Well, if they will. Professor Begg, what's your thought?
Well, there are ways in which Davos can help, notably by putting relevant people in the same room. For example, one major challenge this year is going to be how to deal with the crisis in the World Trade Organization because of the dysfunctionality of the appellate body. That has to be solved. As has already been said, China, Europe, Australia and others and India are working together to try to find an alternative form of dispute resolution. That can make progress.
Ian Begg.
A delicious possibility could...
Ian Begg, Jimmy Zhu and Liu Baocheng, thank you so much for joining us.